Now for a closer look at the internet infrastructure here in the US, I'm joined by Roger Cheng. Roger is the head of CNET News, one of the top US online tech magazines. Welcome to the program, Roger.
Thanks for having me.
So, let's start with this digital divide here in the country. I want to try to figure out, how do we get to this point, and why is it so difficult to get all Americans equitable access to broadband internet?
Well, there's a number of problems. The United States is unique, especially if you look at its geography, right? It's not like a handful of densely populated cities. It is a mixture of big cities and lots of rural areas. So building out an infrastructure that can connect everyone has proven to be difficult and very costly. And if you look at comparison between, say, the U.S. and Europe, where there are a lot more competitors, there's a lot less competitive pressure, and as noted, for a lot of Americans, you usually only have one choice, if that, when it comes to broadband access. So there are a lot of different dynamics, both from a competitive perspective and a cost perspective, that really affect the fact that we just really has a big impact on how little access some folks have to broadband.
So President Biden is now proposing some $94 billion, almost $100 billion, to build, a high-speed broadband infrastructure. Do you think that's enough to get this universal connection in this vast nation, given that geography you mentioned?
It's definitely a good start. You have to keep in mind that it's not in a vacuum. There's actually already billions of funding already earmarked for deployment out in rural America, as well as upgrades in more metro, more heavily populated areas. Because one area that isn't talked about a lot are the densely populated areas, often poor neighborhoods that are occupied by black and brown communities, where the infrastructure hasn't been upgraded. So the internet service is available, but it's slow and wouldn't really be considered broadband. And it's the one thing that we found during the pandemic, when everyone was locked down, was you don't just need internet. You need speedy, fast internet that allows for things like video conferencing, that allows for education, for remote schooling. And some of these things some of these networks, some of these communities aren't getting that kind of connection. So the investment will have to be twofold. It can't just be in rural America, but really in densely populated cities. So those billions are being committed, I think, is a good start. But I think most of the estimates would agree that that's really just a start for what is really needed for broadband investment.
I'm glad you bring up these poor communities who have been, really affected by slow internet, because there's the whole question of access, and then there's affordability, right? So how does the country also make sure that, broadband really is a necessity and not just a luxury?
There's an ongoing debate about that. The FCC has rolled out this emergency broadband benefit plan that basically subsidizes the service for a lot of folks. There are a number of private and nonprofit efforts out there that are sort of local efforts, local initiatives that are pushing for more low-cost service, making that more widely available to these kinds of communities. At CNET, we've been chronicling a lot of this, sort of the rise of some of these efforts. Companies, even big companies like Microsoft, have kind of chipped in to help connect communities in some of these cities. So I think it's going to be a broadband effort, or it's a broad effort, not just that isn't just fueled by the government and the funding there, but I think it will have to be a cooperation of smaller providers, nonprofits. There has to be sort of a broader effort and broader initiative with multiple partners to really solve this problem.
I also want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier when you brought up Europe. How does the US compare with other developed nations in terms of broadband coverage and penetration? Because there's no surprise, right, that some of the smallest, richest nations do really well. South Korea, Singapore, Monaco all come to mind. So where would you put the US in comparison?
I know in terms of broadband speeds, the U.S. has dropped out of the top 10, but you have to keep in mind, it is a lot easier to build out infrastructure in South Korea or Hong Kong or Taiwan, because it is this small, densely packed city that you could build infrastructure, and the return on investment on that infrastructure is fairly easy to get, right? Whereas the return on investment when you're building out in these rural communities, where maybe you'll get a handful of customers, none of which are paying that much, the investment there is a lot more questionable. That's why in the past it's been a lot more difficult here in America to get investment out in some of those rural communities.
Roger, we have about 30 seconds left. Very quickly, how far would you say the U.S. is away from, the future, the Internet of Things and actual smart cities?
I mean, we're definitely a bit further away. It definitely depends on the cities that you're looking at, right? I think with densely populated cities like New York and Boston, there are already smart city initiatives going on. I've talked to carriers like Verizon and AT&T have put a lot of money into setting up these kinds of systems in place using 5G to really run the city. So it really depends on your definition of a smart city, because there are smart city aspects already in place and things that are being deployed now. But if you're talking about that sort of futuristic Star Trek-like city, we're clearly years away with self-driving cars and drones flying everywhere. We're clearly years away from that. But some of those smart city elements are already in place or are being put in place now.
I look forward to that day. Roger Cheng, head of CNET News, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.